Out in a deep red stretch of Iowa, a state auditor keeps winning elections by leaving his partisan labels at the door to talk about quiet competence. Writing for The Atlantic this August, Elaine Godfrey suggests this focus on efficiency might offer a survival guide. But just days later in the American Prospect, Harold Meyerson points in the opposite direction. Pulling from mid-century history, Meyerson argues that abandoning aggressive class conflict for polite technocracy was a historical mistake. Placing these two pieces together reveals a sharp split over how to build political power. There is a real puzzle here about what works better, turning the volume down to fix the plumbing, or turning it up to pick a fight. Pedaling a bicycle up an Iowa county road, a man running for governor cuts through a crowd of voters who treat him like a rock star. In a profile published last week, Elaine Godfrey follows state auditor Rob Sand to see how he thrives in deep red territory by focusing on quiet competence over political labels. Notice how far he goes to avoid those labels, even asking staff to strip Democratic logos from the walls before a speech.
Somewhere along the county road between Independence and Manchester, I lost Rob Sand. This had been a distinct possibility when I agreed to join the 44-year-old Democratic candidate for governor on a segment of a week-long bike ride across Iowa. Unlike Sand, I am not a biker, merely a leisurely walker, and like any good millennial woman, an occasional Pilates doer. Which is why on a long, low-grade hill dotted with Queen Anne's lace, my quads began to burn, my pace slowed, and the subject of my story disappeared into a rainbow river of helmets. A minute later, the sag wagon overtook me. Soon, so did a 9-year-old boy. Thankfully, my humiliation was short-lived. These days in Iowa, one can never truly be without Rob Sand. Even as I panted alone at the back of the peloton, I could hear people chattering about the man who would be governor. Was that who I think it was? They said. And, oh, I just love him. At one point, a fit-looking cyclist who turned out to be the former NFL wide receiver Tim Dwight pulled up beside me to lament Iowa's unfulfilled economic potential. This is why, he said, we need Rob. Sand, the state auditor, is ubiquitous in Iowa. On any given day, one might encounter him in a TV ad promising jail time for corrupt politicians, on Instagram talking through a mouthful of Casey's breakfast pizza, and at a town hall singing America the Beautiful with a bipartisan crowd of gray hairs. Sand is something rarely found in nature, a successful Iowa Democrat, which is perhaps why his presence generates such mania. Biking with him across the state felt a little like showing up to a middle school slumber party with Taylor Swift, or riding shotgun in the Polkmobile. Despite Sand's bike helmet and lack of signage, hundreds of people recognized him and begged for selfies. "I nearly killed Iowa's next governor," yelled a man in Winthrop who bumped into Sand's bike. People often used both his first and last name, running them together into a single word. "I let my bike pump to Rob Sand," another man declared in Independence. Sand's party has struggled to gain purchase in Iowa since the dawn of the Trump era, and a Democrat hasn't been elected governor since 2006. The funny thing is, Sand is not a particularly proud Democrat. He tends to refer to the party as the lesser of two evils, and made a face when I asked whether he enjoyed being in it. "I can't imagine saying I like being in any political party," he told me. "I love being a dad." Before addressing a crowd in Des Moines County last year, Sand's staff asked for party insignia to be removed from the walls to make the space more inclusive. The auditor obviously wants to steer clear of the National Party's noxious fumes. But whereas his progressive contemporaries distance themselves by railing against the establishment, Sand's campaign approach has been different. Quietly, and with an easygoing optimism that Fred Rogers would envy, Sand questions the concept of partisanship itself. Our political system is broken, and it's broken mostly because it's run by two private clubs that make voters feel trapped into making a binary choice, he told a crowd last month in Newton. The good news is that Iowa is a place where we have typically said we are going to make politics work for ordinary people. National Democrats like what they see, even if they find it tough to describe. Sand is doing the opposite of what almost every other politician is doing, the strategist and former Pete Buttigieg advisor Liz Smith told me. He isn't a loud progressive, but he also doesn't sound like a corporate moderate, Adam Carlson, a pollster, agreed. Sand is doing a third thing. In November, Sand will be up against a potentially strong GOP candidate, but his most daunting adversary will be the math. Registered Republicans outnumber Democrats by almost 200,000 in Iowa, which means that Sand plans to spend the next 11 weeks telling Iowans that he can be trusted, in spite of the D behind his name. Will enough of them believe it? Sand had been annoyed the last time I wrote about him. I'd included all of the relevant background details in my story. That he grew up in Decorah, a town near the Minnesota border, which explains his long vowels. Sand pronounces it Decorah. That he went to Brown University and worked a few modeling jobs in Europe before attending law school and working for 7 years as a prosecutor. I'd explained that, like any good red state Democrat, Sand loves to hunt and spends Sunday morning in church, and that his wife's brothers called him Baby Jesus for his tendency towards self-righteousness. But Sand was concerned about something else, that I had not fully captured his frustration with America's two-party political system. I was hoping you'd get more into election reform, he texted me. A sentence that I am confident no one has ever said before or since. At the time, I did not imagine that many readers were pining to hear a state auditor's thoughts on the decline of bipartisanship.
But here we are, 3 summers later, and Sand is still talking about the same ideas, moving to an open primary system and implementing approval voting, which would allow Iowans to support more than one candidate. More remarkable, voters are listening. Sand is a Democrat because Jesus is for the little guy, and the Democratic Party at its best is for the little guy. But his more inclusive vision wouldn't require party affiliation. The scramble to replace Graham Plattner in Maine, for example, wouldn't have happened under Sand's system, he said. Or if a really old candidate, hypothetically, had a bad debate experience, and everyone was like, maybe this person is too old to do this, it wouldn't be a crisis. The reforms would reward civility, Sand added, and prevent one-party domination of a state. Republicans have had total control over Iowa for a decade. In that time, they've dramatically cut income taxes, redirected hundreds of millions of public dollars toward private schools, and restricted abortion after 6 weeks. Right now, the state is facing a $1 billion budget shortfall and the second highest cancer rate in the country. But Sand does not harp on Republicans. Actually, a Sand political event doesn't really feel like one. Each town hall begins with a round of applause for the Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, for good measure, who showed up, then transitions into a group rendition of America the Beautiful. Sand speaks for a while about his policy priorities, corruption, public education, affordability, before opening the floor to questions, some friendly and others confrontational. The event I attended in Newton concluded with a resounding cheer for, you guessed it, a return to divided government in Iowa.
An observer might fairly describe all of this as just a tad cringe. But one person's cringe is another's stirring call for unity. There's a movement afoot for change, and he comes along at a good time, Steve Mullen, a retired teacher, told me in Newton. It helps that Sand does not behave like most Democrats. He is not, for example, easily drawn into culture war debates or bandwagon slogans. Early in his campaign, when a radio host asked him whether biological males should be allowed to play in women's sports, Sand answered succinctly, no. In January, after federal officers killed Renee Good and Alex Preddy in Minneapolis, Sand did not join in the calls to abolish ICE. He's taken some of the cultural issues that dog Democrats in red states off the table, Adam Gentleson, the founder of the center-left think tank Searchlight, told me. The progressive left, as you might imagine, is not wild about Sand. Some were disgusted, for example, that the Democrat did not release a statement denouncing ICE after Good's and Preddy's deaths. Others see Sand's comments on trans athletes as a betrayal of the LGBTQ community. Still, most seem to find the state auditor tolerable. He's a happy warrior for nonpartisan technocratic efficiency and anti-corruption, Adam Green, the co-founder of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, told me. Sand might slap that on a billboard. Iowa's state auditor can seem a little naive.
Even if he becomes governor, Sand would almost certainly be working with a Republican state legislature that won't be eager to hand him any wins. But Sand says he isn't worried. There's still a lot of people of good faith in that caucus, Sand told me at a deli in Manchester after we'd finished our bike ride.
State GOP lawmakers know that they'll need to have something to show for their public service when they reach the pearly gates. Had Sand met a politician recently, I thought? When I voiced my doubts out loud, Sand looked stricken. I am really hopeful, he said. Meanwhile, Republicans are busy trying to convince Iowa voters that the auditor is more extreme than his kumbaya suggests. It's like the Truman Show, Zach Lawn, Sand's GOP opponent, says in one campaign video. He's not a moderate. In another, Lawn pledges to take back Iowa's public school curriculum from the Marxists who hijacked it. Lawn, a former Republican operative, seemed to come out of nowhere in June when he defeated incumbent Representative Randy Feenstra for the GOP nomination. More specifically, Lawn came from Kansas. Although he was born and raised in Iowa, he has lived in Wichita, where he founded a private school for much of the past decade. The Des Moines Register reported that Lawn splits his time between Iowa and his second home in Kansas, where some of his children live, although Lawn reassured Iowans that if he is elected governor, he will be in the state as much as humanly possible. Lawn did not respond to my requests for comment. But Lawn's outsider status might help him. He has no elected office experience and is not yet a known quantity in Iowa, which means that he does not wear the albatross of incumbency. So far, he's campaigned on protecting small farms from corporate agriculture, an unusual Republican position in the state. For this, as well as his pledge to ban mRNA vaccines and improve the state's water quality, Lawn has also received the MAHA stamp of approval.
Several conservative Iowans along the bike route told me that they wouldn't have voted for Feenstra, but they were considering Lawn's new ideas. Lately, Republicans have accused Sand of doing too much stumping and not enough of his day job. They've also drawn attention to the significant campaign donations from his wife and her wealthy family. But Lawn's main project ahead of November will be to remind Iowans that Sand, regardless of his rhetoric, is running as a Democrat. At Sand's Newton Town Hall, a Lawn supporter named Carrie Atkinson asked the auditor to declare the number of weeks at which he would support a ban on abortion. Sand answered that he thought Roe v. Wade was a reasonable decision. He didn't answer my question, Atkinson told me later. At another event, a local Republican activist named Gary Loeffler asked Sand to justify his support for abortion as a Christian. There are many verses in the Bible that say life begins at breath, Sand said, an answer that enraged some religious conservatives. Republicans believe, or say they believe, that Sand, a wealthy guy with an Ivy League education, is far more liberal than he lets on. Loeffler offered a disturbing visual. Like an infested cob of sweet corn, Sand might look normal on the outside, but inside he's full of worms. Luckily, I was able to test Loeffler's hypothesis by traveling to Sand's hometown and peering into the proverbial husk. In Decorah, along the upper Iowa River, I attended Nordic Fest, a celebration of Scandinavian heritage that included Viking battle reenactments, Nordic dancers, and a parade featuring Sand in the back of a convertible. It felt a little like visiting Bedford Falls with George Bailey.
"This is Rob Sand. He's a good friend of my eldest son," the announcer said as the auditor drove by. Sand's aunt, who ran the Lefse stand, trotted into the street to give him a package of fresh Norwegian flatbread. Sand's father asked me, in Norwegian, if I spoke the language of my ancestors. I do not. After the parade, Sand offered a ride tour of his hometown. Walking down the main drag, he pointed out the old teen center. Can you guess how many times we went? Near a statue of a long-snouted woodland creature, he explained, "Trolls are out in the world and can be dangerous." Quickly, we were overwhelmed by friends and well-wishers. Among them was Andy Rasmussen, Sand's best friend from high school. Sand was always smart and ambitious, Rasmussen, who does auto body work in Decorah, told me later. He liked to skateboard and bow hunt. He didn't drink, but he'd give friends rides to parties. The running joke was that someday Rob's going to be president, Rasmussen said. But what were Sand's politics back then? I wanted to know. Is he a Trojan horse of socialist cornworms? Rasmussen basically shrugged. He will generally talk to and listen to anybody that's out there. Others who knew Sand during college and law school similarly described a man committed to listening.
At Brown in the early 2000s, Sand frequently criticized the Bush administration in his column in the school paper. Still, he recruited Stephen Beale, a conservative columnist at the paper, to start a new class on conservative thought, featuring readings from Edmund Burke, Barry Goldwater, and Pat Buchanan. Sand is still being his authentic self, Beale, who now works as a freelance writer, told me.
He really does care about hearing the other side. I thought about Sand's cheering section at the Nordic Fest parade. "Light 'em up, Rob," one man had shouted, but Sand had waved him off. No, he'd said. The next 2 months may not be so friendly. So far, Sand has outraised Lon, but Republicans are pouring millions into the state, partly thanks to a high-profile Senate bid from Democrat Josh Turek and 3 surprisingly competitive House races. Expect ads from both parties to be vicious and pervasive. On Thursday, screaming activists for Turning Point Action chased Sand around the Iowa State Fair. Right now, Sand looks reasonably well positioned for victory. The Cook Political Report has changed its analysis of the race from lean Republican to toss-up, and new polling shows Sand leading Lon by 5 points. If he succeeds, Democrats might finally be able to say out loud what many have believed for years, that Iowa still defies partisan categorization. Many Iowans are only now starting to pay attention. Before I lost Sand on the bike ride, a middle-aged man named Ethan Voss had rolled up next to us. "Are you who I think you are?" he asked Sand, sounding more suspicious than excited. The two chatted for a moment, but Voss soon pedaled away, looking unimpressed. An hour later, though, he was back, this time to talk with Sand about his job and his kids. Voss wasn't sure how he'd vote this year, he told me later. He typically leans right, but there was something different about Sand.
Elaine Godfrey leaves the listener with the image of Rob Sand pedaling across Iowa, dodging the Democratic label as if it were a pothole. His strategy for survival in deep red territory is to strip away the partisan fight entirely. He offers quiet, cheerful competence instead, taking down party signs and focusing on the math of state audits. It looks like a practical survival guide for a hostile political climate. But turning to Harold Meyerson, that exact approach takes on a completely different weight. Meyerson reaches back to the mid-century journals of Arthur Schlesinger to track how the party originally traded the bare-knuckle class politics of the New Deal for the understated, anti-rhetorical mood of the technocrat. Notice what happens when these two visions sit side by side. Both writers are looking at the exact same instinct, the political urge to drop the ideological fight and just focus on making things work. Read alone, Godfrey's profile makes Sand's anti-partisan optimism look like a fresh Midwestern rebellion. Read alongside Meyerson, that same cheerful retreat from the party brand looks less like a new tactic and more like the culmination of a decades-long historical mistake. Godfrey sees the only way a politician survives today. Meyerson sees the exact habit that cost the party its soul.
I've been reading the journals of historian, speechwriter, liberal activist, Prospect founding sponsor Arthur Schlesinger over the past week. They've helped me understand a good deal about American liberalism, as well as making clear, were there any doubt, that the line between Harvard historian and party animal was, and surely still is, easy to cross. Schlesinger's 3-volume history of the New Deal, written during the 1950s, remains essential reading for anyone interested in the waxing and waning of American liberalism. Even as Schlesinger was embarked on that project, he also became one of the leading speechwriters for Adlai Stevenson, the Illinois governor who was the Democrats' presidential nominee in 1952 and 1956, losing both times, decisively, to Dwight Eisenhower. Despite his allegiance to and affection for Stevenson, Schlesinger admits in his 1952 journal entries that Stevenson had no interest in incorporating the class-based politics of the New Deal and of Harry Truman's Fair Deal into his speeches and, more broadly, into his political identity. A few weeks after Stevenson's loss to Eisenhower, Schlesinger writes, "Adlai was right that we should not run against Hoover, the Republican president on whose watch the pre-New Deal economy collapsed, and against whose relatively laissez-faire and pro-corporate economics both Roosevelt and Truman had successfully campaigned." This issue meant very little to younger people, Schlesinger continues,
for whom Social Security and collective bargaining and economic opportunity were as secure and unalterable parts of the landscape as the trees and bushes. A decade later, while working in John F. Kennedy's White House, Schlesinger comes away from a meeting with UAW President Walter Reuther and Senator
Hubert Humphrey, noting that both of them still spoke in the New Deal's distinctive rhetoric. Walter and Hubert could talk about the people, about their ultimate wisdom, and the importance of doing things for them, in a way quite alien to the new frontier, the not particularly class-based perspective of the Kennedy administration. I wish I could figure out, Schlesinger laments, the terms in which the idealism and imagination of the New Deal could be infused into the anti-sentimental, anti-rhetorical, understated mood of the new frontier, whose leaders he terms technocrats. Read today, these passages illuminate the links between the shifting shapes of American liberalism, and for that matter, American socialism, and the American economy. Writing at a time when New Deal reforms had produced an economy of opportunity as secure and unalterable as the landscape, when, as historian Nelson Lichtenstein recently noted in our pages, the real wages of working-class Americans doubled in a single generation, the post-war Democratic establishment had abandoned the class politics of its predecessors, whose victories had appeared to create a permanent middle-class majority. Reuther and Humphrey, by contrast, were at that point semi-social Democrats who were concerned about those who either didn't make it into that middle-class majority or whose membership therein was precarious. At the time, as Schlesinger noted ruefully, their concerns about these numerically marginal constituencies, at least that was how they were viewed by the liberal establishment, registered only at the margins of liberal consciousness. The whole point of Michael Harrington's The Other America, published in 1962, was to document the persistence of American poverty at a time when that poverty, as opposed to the pervasive poverty that preceded World War II, had become largely invisible. Today on Tap, this story first appeared in our free Today on Tap newsletter, a weekday email featuring commentary on the daily news from Prospect reporters. Even as Schlesinger was writing his Stevenson and Kennedy-era journal entries, American liberalism was slowly turning to those who'd been excluded by reason of race or gender from the rights and benefits of post-New Deal citizenship. It was black activists who compelled the Democrats to focus on ending, or at least diminishing, those exclusions. But despite the socialist ideals of such civil rights leaders as Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, and Bayard Rustin, it was the prisms of race and gender, far more than that of class, through which Democrats viewed the American landscape, and through which they largely defined themselves for the rest of the 20th century. But can anyone look at what Schlesinger was writing in the 1950s and yet still marvel at the rebirth of class-based progressivism and socialism today? There are virtually no young people today who view their economic prospects as secure and unalterable, a view we now know was peculiar to the boomer generation. Is it any wonder that DSA, despite the fierce moral commitments of its founders, stayed a small organization of several thousand until the crash of 2008 and its prolonged and incomplete recovery made clear to young people then and since that the economy, deregulated and all but devoid of unions, was anything but secure? Is it any wonder that this year's Democratic primaries, including this week's in Florida, are defined by the precinct walking and phone banking of the young, class-based left, while the Democrats opposed to them can mobilize money, but few, if any, volunteers? The technocrats are being driven from the Democrats' temple, or opting rather to hurriedly grasp onto some of the class war perspectives that the Democratic base has embraced. While Schlesinger would doubtless reject some of DSA's stances, as do AOC and Bernie Sanders, and it's hard to imagine Angie Nixon celebrating Fidel, I'm confident he'd welcome the Democrats' turn to a 21st century version of the New Deal. They're speaking his preferred language again.
What lingers after looking at these two maps is a stark choice about how to hold political ground. One approach demands dropping the party labels and simply making the math work for everyday people. The other insists on picking a loud fight and drawing a hard line in the dirt. Both strategies claim to offer the only real way forward. But as the next election approaches, a simple question remains. Do voters ultimately want a leader who fixes the plumbing or someone who leads the strike.